Really excited to announce Dale today. Dale came and spoke at one of my first Conscious Dying events, and it was incredible. And we've been in touch ever since. He's fantastic, and really have learned a lot from him, a lot of wisdom and experience. And we share a sort of common lineage. He spent a lot of time with Neem Karoli Baba, and so I have a very deep connection with him as well. So it's kind of nice to see him and be reminded of all of that. So I would like to introduce him now. Dale Borglum is the founder and executive director of the Living Dying Project. He's a pioneer in the conscious dying movement and has worked directly with thousands of people with life-threatening illnesses and their families for over 30 years. In 1981, Dale founded the first resident facility for people who wish to die consciously in the United States, the Dying Center. He has taught and lectured extensively on the topics of spiritual support for those with life-threatening illnesses, on caregiving as a spiritual practice, and on healing at the edge of illness, the edge of death, of loss, and of crisis. Dale has a BS from UC Berkeley and a PhD from Stanford University. He is the co-author of Journey of Awakening, a meditator's guidebook, Bantam Books, and has taught meditation for the past 35 years. He has intensively immersed himself in the practices of devotion, meditation, and contemplative prayer for over 40 years, studying with many of the greatest masters of the last century, including Neem Karoli Baba, Suzuki Roshi, Anandamayi Ma, Kalu Rinpoche, the 16th...
You want me to read it? You can skip all those guys, okay. That's fine.
Lots of awesome teachers, we'll just say that names that I shouldn't butcher right now. And Dale has taught with Ram Dass, Stephen Levine, Joan Halifax, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Reverend Wayne Muller, and many others. His life's work and passion has been and continues to be healing of our individual and collective relationship with death, and also our mortality as an inspiration for spiritual awakening. Thank you, Dale, for being here.
You're very welcome. It's so good to be here, and I apologize for not having been here for more of the workshop, but I had some unexpected family obligations that involved Little League Baseball. It's true. And they won. Yay. Okay. I would like to explore with you conscious grieving. We have an hour and a half to do that, and it seems like a very mature group of people here, so if at any point you would like to interrupt or comment or question, please feel free to do that. I will give some overview in the beginning, and hopefully then we'll have a lot of time to open it up for discussion. Have you guys been meditating together? Okay. There is a teacher named Gurdjieff who said that only conscious grieving, only conscious suffering is of use. And when grieving or when suffering of any kind arises, there are three possible responses. We can push it away, get distracted, get busy, have overly rigid boundaries, and not feel what's going on. We can get lost in the emotion and the suffering and the grief, having over permeable boundaries, and really feel what's going on, but be so lost in it that we're not staying present and conscious through the process. Or there's the third possibility, not pushing away, not getting lost, but being compassionate. And Rumi has a wonderful quote that grief is the garden of compassion. A garden is a place where something wonderful grows, something we would like to look at or eat, or something productive. So there is a way of talking about the spiritual path as learning to transmute suffering or grief into compassion, working with a healing process that we'll be talking about here today. And I have put together a healing paradigm that I use in the groups that I facilitate that has 5 stages toward healing. Bear with me, and I'll try to make the didactic part of all of this as short as possible. Firstly, we need motivation. And if you're grieving, that is probably motivation enough. If you are lost in grief, there is part of you that wants to be moving toward a healed heart. In a way, grief dares us to love again. And yet, at times, it seems that grief is so pervasive and so difficult that love becomes impossible, that compassion becomes impossible. Because you have come to this workshop, I would guess that many of you are actively grieving, or at least working with people who are actively grieving. And I would, though, also suggest that everyone is grieving, that there is a background of grief that keeps us separate from each other, that we've all lost a lot. And we get used to this background grief, this low level of grief. We assume that is the nature of things. We assume that is something that is human nature, but in fact it's not. And learning to be with that background grief, learning to be with the grief right now in this moment, how much we're separate from ourselves, how much we're separate from each other. To the extent we can do that, it will prepare us when a major episode of grief arises in our lives. So, in Eastern meditative practices, which I would guess almost all of you have some familiarity with, it is assumed that before we begin to practice that we're relatively unneurotic and we like each other, ourselves. The Dalai Lama on his 3rd visit to America said, "Now I'm beginning to understand, and it makes me very sad, you Americans don't like yourselves." These Eastern practices were developed by and for people several thousand years ago who were grounded, centered, unneurotic, and loved their parents. And if any of you are in that category, you can get up and leave right now, and probably you don't need me or what's going on at this workshop. But the problem is, if we're beginning the spiritual process, and I guess what I'm suggesting here is that conscious grieving is a spiritual process. If we're beginning the spiritual process from a starting point of being ungrounded, uncentered, and neurotic, that you can, without too much imagination, guess that not too far down the road there are going to be all kinds of roadblocks and detours. Now, I'm not suggesting there is a shortcut, but there is a way of not getting lost in all these detours because of how neurotic we are in the first place. So we can explore this process of conscious grieving from the standpoint of the body, somatic medicine, martial arts, from the standpoint of the mind, Buddhism and psychotherapy, or from the standpoint of the heart, which are devotional practices of Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity. And for many of us, we don't just pick one of those. I mean, there are a few people who are Buddhists, but I've met very few of them. And most people bounce around between using their body, using their relationship with spirit through their heart, and using their mind. And for most people, it seems very useful to be able to explore our healing process through each of these 3 channels. of body, mind, and living spirit. So in the beginning, we need to have enough motivation to really look clearly at what it is that's going on. How can we begin to transmute our grief into compassion? And what actually is grief? Grief is the negative emotions that arise in response to feeling separate. And compassion has as defining qualities a feeling of being connected, of having a spacious heart, spacious in that it's not too much filled with I, and a warm heart. So that immediately there is suggested a practice. When we begin to feel separate, like right now, I mean, you don't know me, I've shown up here just a few minutes ago, and a few of you I've met before, most of you not. We're all going to die, but we don't know when. It could be before the end of my talk. Roger Ebert, the film critic who died of a very difficult cancer, was interviewed and asked how his cancer had affected his life. And he said, as I'm typing this sentence, I don't know that I'm going to be alive when I type the period at the end of this sentence. So we all kind of intellectually know we're going to die, but we don't know when. I mean, what could be more intellectually obvious than that? But if we really bring that truth into this moment, how does it affect the way we're looking at each other, we're listening to what I'm saying, we're breathing? How does it affect that? In Buddhism, as a way of cultivating motivation to look at what's difficult, and grief is certainly often difficult to be with, there are what are called the four mind-turning truths that turn the mind toward the Dharma. The first mind-turning truth is you're going to die, but you don't know when. The second one is that life is precious. This moment is the only moment that you and I can awaken. It can't happen later. It can only happen right now. The third mind-turning truth is there's karma. What we do, think, or say has an effect. And the fourth one is that we act unconsciously with clinging and condemning, suffering arises. So, once again, this being a relatively sophisticated group of people, those truths are intellectually obvious. But can we really allow them to sink into our being? Can we gather them together as one would gather a bouquet of flowers? And take that truth, you're going to die, but you don't know when. The truth that life is so precious. There's karma, there's suffering. Bring them together and let that be something that inspires us to be as awake right now to what our life is. The feelings of connectedness, of compassion, as well as the feelings of separation and grief. Now, after motivation comes a stage that I call invocation. It could be called awareness, trusting being present. In Buddhism, there's the whole school of practice called Vipassana, Hinayana, or Theravada Buddhism, where the main practice is learning to be aware. And being aware of how we're grieving, what it feels like in the body, how we feel separate, how at times it becomes overwhelming, is a difficult practice. It's a difficult practice till we bring in the next stage of compassion. But we can't have compassion for something until we're aware of it in a very direct, naked, vivid way. Interestingly, the body-based invocation stage is where, for me at least, a lot of healing happens. How do we trust being present in our bodies? And let's think about a hypothetical little girl who's born and has a relatively non-traumatic birthing process. And what does she learn in the first 2 years of her life? she learns being grounded. She learns that she can trust being dependent, that when she takes a crawling movement or a step, that the earth is going to be there to support her. That when she's being held by her mother, that her mother's not going to drop her. That there is this sense of support, that it's okay to let go, to trust that you can be dependent and supported by Mother, Mother Image, Mother Earth. And because apparently none of us have had enlightened mothers, that we go through that stage only incompletely. And people in the West tend to be ungrounded, particularly when difficult emotions arise. One can go along feeling present, relaxed, and somebody says something or looks at you in a funny way. And usually the tendency is to go up in the mind and say, why are they doing that? What did I do? What's going on? What should I do? Rather than trusting this sense of being connected to the earth. And I'm not at all here to criticize mothers. I had a wonderful mother, and she had her issues too. One of my friends who was a therapist said, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. But to learn this practice of being grounded, of dropping down into the base of your torso, the perineum, letting that be a support for the healing work that we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. So that trying to do healing work, trying to open to your grief from an ungrounded stance, one can imagine is going to be very difficult. At the same time, having the trust to drop down and be grounded, to be present when something in you is screaming to get away, to not be present, does take practice. I have a PhD in mathematics. I have been trained to jump up into my mind, to analyze, to figure out, to categorize. And probably most of you have careers that involve making subtle distinctions in your mind and jumping up in your mind as a way of making your way through the world. There's nothing wrong with the mind as a tool, but when we get lost in it, the mind is a big impediment. There's the thinking mind and the working mind. When you need to make your grocery list or do your income taxes or think about what you're going to do today, you can use the working mind, no problem. But usually the thinking mind, which arises unconsciously, is that which we use to separate ourselves from difficult feelings, to get out of our connectedness with our grief, with our feelings of separation, with our feelings of loneliness, or fear, anxiety, agitation, whatever that might happen to be. So here's this little girl. For the first couple years of her life, she's learning to be dependent, to trust that it's okay to let go. And then about the age of 2, the task changes to learning to be independent or autonomous. That's why for a lot of children it's called the terrible twos, because there is this movement back and forth between being independent and dependent. This little girl is exploring, pulling away from the mother image, feeling how safe it is or how safe it's not, coming back, back and forth, and that can create a lot of confusion for everybody in the immediate vicinity. Being centered in the lower belly, the Japanese call it the hara, the Chinese the dantian, the Sufis the kath, is the place from which martial arts are done. And being centered then allows us to be independent, to trust that we can be with what it is that's going on. If there's not an autonomous being there, how are you going to be doing your grief work? How are you going to be moving fluidly through life? And in fact, many traditions say that this belly is what supports the open heart. Because if one is not centered, then the heart is going to be opening and closing only in response to how safe the environment feels. And the environment is not intrinsically safe. There's a lot of frightened people out there, a lot of aggressive people out there. We know the world's not safe. So that if we can only open our hearts when the environment is safe, then we're going to have to be judging the environment all the time. Is it safe now? Is it not safe now? And you have probably been around somebody you were very much in love with. You were having this wonderful connection. And they look at you slightly cross-eyed, or they get a little agitated about something that might not have anything to do with you at all. And all of a sudden, your heart closes. You feel hurt by what they're doing. Whereas if you were really centered, you can allow somebody to have their suffering. Now, I don't say this to my dying clients usually, but suffering is only suffering. Cancer does not cause suffering. Resistance to cancer causes suffering. My brother died of pancreatic cancer last Halloween. I had prostate cancer myself a few years ago. Non-life-threatening. I got rid of the prostate, no more cancer, lucky me. But if we can very clearly see how suffering arises and not ascribe it to outside events. There's a slogan in Tibetan Buddhism. It's a slightly confusing one, but I'll give it to us anyway and then explain. It says, drive all blames into oneself. Drive all blames into oneself. So what we're not saying here is that you're supposed to blame yourself, but when you notice that you're blaming the external environment for the way you're feeling, in that moment, healing can't happen. We have to pull the blame back inside and take our responsibility for, here's the way I'm feeling. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and you start getting all enraged. Why does he think he deserves the road more than I do? And as long as you're blaming that other person, or you're blaming the weather, or you're blaming the Republican Party, or you're blaming the Democratic Party, or you're blaming anything, in that moment, healing cannot happen. So we get grounded and centered so that we can look at the way this blaming is going on, how this voice as a way of avoiding responsibility, of pulling back from what could be a healing moment. We do that by blaming. So motivation is strong enough. Okay, I'm grieving. There's pain in my body. There's pain in my heart. I feel separate from you. I'm going to die, but I don't know when. We have this motivation. Right now, can we not just do this intellectually, but can you allow this notion of you're going to die, but you don't know when, to be a contemplation, to sink into a deep place inside of yourself? So that in this moment, here we are, this precious moment. And as we do that then, can we invoke? Invoke from the heart in the sense of saying, I know God exists, or I know the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha exist, or the higher power, or the spirit of truth, whatever it is. And open to receiving that. Open the heart, that the heart can trust being present. From the standpoint of the mind, invocation is being present in the sense of awareness or mindfulness, meeting each changing object. And from the standpoint of the body, it's being grounded and being centered down in the lower belly, inhabiting the lower part of your body as a preparation for the next stage, which is compassion. And a lot of grief work has to do with trusting the heart to open to feelings that are right on the edge of being unbearable. The groups I lead are called Healing at the Edge. And everybody's at some edge. The edge of grief, the edge of illness, the edge of loss, the edge of fear, whatever it might be, the edge of addiction. We're all working with some kind of edge. And being able then to open our heart to that place is very often requiring us to get grounded, get centered, pay attention beforehand. So before I plunge on, let me open the floor to comments or questions. Yeah, please.
Thank you for showing up today, by the way. You have a lot of wisdom. And I guess the question then, at least from an experiential, because I think I came from this place, being a very healthy person, and then went into not health. And in those moments, I had to not open, I mean, sometimes moments aren't precious. And sometimes illness creates a time where you just get through it. And so, the reason I guess I'm emotional about this is I work also, I'm a volunteer with cancer patients. And I see them suffering with this kind of, they're not able to open, and they're now blaming themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I have so much compassion for that, because I think somewhere I knew you don't have to be conscious through everything, to whatever you have to do to get through, because it's not really in your control. You have chemicals, you have needles, you have crazy things going on. And
what isn't in your control? Could you say that again?
I didn't feel like I had a lot of control of what was happening at the moment with me physically.
But you have a chance of how you respond to it.
Yeah,
You have
my
a control.
response, and sometimes it was the healthiest for me was just to do whatever I could to get through it.
Sure.
I mean, I never had a TV for 25 years, but today I can tell you Hulu saved my life. Going into somebody else's world, escaping from my mind, knowing that maybe in an hour this would subside, and not being so conscious, actually. And so I just wanted to share that as a way of, and I don't know how that's held with the practice, but coping sometimes, just coping.
Just
Coping.
coping.
Just coping. Not opening, not pushing, escaping.
Okay.
Was a big gift to me. So, just to offer that.
Every moment is open to awareness and compassion.
Yeah.
If things become overwhelming and paying attention to what we feel like now is too much, sometimes it might be necessary to take a break. Taking a break doesn't mean that that material isn't still going to be there. It doesn't mean that you're going to escape. Taking the big break of committing suicide doesn't mean that the karma that you're trying to get away from is going to magically disappear because one has chosen to reshuffle the deck, if you will. So what I'm talking about here is a developmental or hierarchical healing process. And the first stage is motivation. So depending on how strong your motivation is, will carry you through those times when you're saying, I don't want to do this now. So suppose you're somebody who's grieving, or you're working with cancer patients, whatever the situation is, and it becomes there's so much difficult emotion flooding your heart that you can't deal with it now. The best thing to do, if you could, best in quote marks, don't tell the Buddhists I use that word. The best thing was, could you in that moment have compassion for the part of yourself that can't have compassion? There's a notion that's not talked too much about in spirituality of being humble and flexible. So we start out, I'm going to do my grief work today, but I can't do it. It's overwhelming. In that moment, can you begin to have compassion for the part of you that can't do the work that you told yourself you were supposed to do? Or instead of that, are you going to feel New Age guilt because you couldn't do it? Robert Bly pronounces New Age newage to rhyme with sewage for some strange reason. And it certainly is possible to get really hard on ourselves because we're not doing what the good book or the teacher or our superego is telling us that we should be doing. And compassion is really learned in the very, very simple moment that happens thousands of times in a day, at least hundreds of times in a day, when you've been asleep, you've been unconscious, and you say, oh, I've been lost in my thoughts for the last 10 seconds or 10 minutes or 10 hours or whatever it is. In that moment, can you come back to being present with mercy, with kindness, with compassion, or is there a yanking, a kind of an aggression, very subtle it can be, where you're coming back to being present? And the more we can do that, then when there's a more overwhelming moment, like the one that you're talking about, we've had practice. We've had practice in being nonviolent. We've had practice in being merciful with ourselves. So if you can be compassionate for the place where you're stuck right now, that's great. If you can't, then we go back to the next stage of invocation. Can I be aware of what it feels like to be this stuck? Can I be grounded and centered in relationship in my body to what it feels like? If I can't do that, then maybe you have to go back to motivation. What do I really want in life? Do I want to be somebody who gives in to feeling overwhelmed by my emotions, or do I want to be awake? How alive am I willing to be? Am I only going to be alive when it's comfortable? Or am I going to say, I want to be alive even if this is a painful moment? I want to be here, present. So, for instance, we could have a whole other discussion about physical pain. I can go to the dentist and have her drill on my nerve without anesthetic, because I would rather not have that needle in my gum and then the rest of the afternoon I can't talk. And I'm not saying you should try to do that, but I would rather be awake. I feel uncomfortable sensation for 30 seconds and just relax through that, then it's done. And a lot of learning for many people, myself certainly included, in how to deal with difficult emotions comes through how I'm learning to be with physical difficult sensations. Pain in my knees, pain in my body in various places like that. So if immediately I feel something unpleasant, I run away from it, then it's going to be difficult to be with difficult emotions. As I sort of implied, since I have a son who's playing Little League Baseball, he's not that old, and when he was younger, I remember one time he was running and playing, and he fell down on cement and he skinned his knee. So he didn't break the skin. There was no blood flowing, but it was a shock, and it hurt. He came running over to me, and I could see that he expected me to do what his mother would do, which was say, "Oh, Declan, that's terrible. Let me hold you. And she's a wonderful mother. There's no criticism. But what I did is I said, "Declan, it doesn't look so bad. I think you're going to be okay." He kind of was shocked for a moment, and he realized that he was reacting to something that had happened 15 seconds before, and that who he was right then was fine. There was a slight tingling in his knee, but it was not a big deal. Okay, so we get conditioned to deal with emotional and physical pain as if it's a big crisis, and it doesn't always have to be. Can we learn to work with a skinned knee? Can we learn to work with feelings of agitation, feelings of despair? I mean, there's a graduated series here, and if you can't deal with the big elephant in the room, then you can deal with the small, cuddly little monkey or whatever is workable for you. Any other remarks or questions before we go forward? So in a very real sense, grief is where we feel separate from ourselves. And that separateness is uncovered when we have a loss and we feel separate from a person who has left us or someone has died. Much of the healing happens when we learn to be not separate from ourselves. when we learn to be grounded, when we learn to be present for whatever may be arising in our lives. So, in a very real sense, grief is as old as our self-image. That when we were very young and we began to buy into the worldview that we're all separate beings, that's when grief began. When someone is dying, they're losing their body, they're losing their mind, they're losing all their stuff, they're losing all their friends, they're losing everything. And right now, it seems that we're separate in this room, that I'm here, I'm talking to you, I'm pointing this direction, you're pointing that direction, I'm a male, most of you are female, I have less hair, you have more hair, I'm this age, you're that age. And in that dimension, you will die and I will die. When we look inside of our experience moment to moment, each moment it's changing. One moment you're hearing my voice, the next moment you're feeling your clothing on your body or the temperature in the room, or there's a thought in your mind. So is there another way of looking at experience? Is there another way of looking around the room and seeing that which does not die? Is there another way of looking around the room and seeing the way that we're not separate? Not in some New Age way of saying, oh, it's just all one. I mean, there is the dimension of one, but there is also the dimension of many. And the work of supporting the dying and the work of grief is to have both of these dimensions alive at the same time. That there is this human dimension where people suffer, people lose things, people have very painful emotions. But at the same time, there is this context that we are as vast as the sky. The mind, the heart-mind, the compassionate heart is as vast as the sky. Is there a way we can look inside of our experience and see that which does not change moment to moment to moment? So right now I'm speaking and your consciousness is probably hearing the sound of my voice. If I stop speaking, then does consciousness continue? Yes, it does. What is it that was the same in both of those moments? Simply consciousness meeting experience. Awareness, pure awareness, meeting experience. And all of the mystical traditions end up saying is that we are that consciousness, we are that awareness that does not die, that cannot lose anything. And so the trick is to be able to keep both dimensions alive at the same time, of the human dimension where we grieve, where we feel separate from each other, where we're trying to be more loving, compassionate human beings, and at the same time, this dimension that is changeless, deathless, and beyond grief. So what I'm kind of suggesting here, I haven't said it too directly yet, is that it is possible to be with grief in a conscious way. It is possible to work with feelings of separation and begin to have a strong enough mountain-like foundation in the lower part of our body to create a sky-like open heart that is boundless enough that we can be with whatever feelings might arise. And what is your name, please?
Denise.
I'm sorry?
Denise.
Denise?
Mm-hmm.
So Denise's question about needing to take time off, can't cope for the time being, there's no rush. Consciousness does not have a timeline. Consciousness, the job of consciousness is to grow and change. It doesn't care how long it takes or how much it hurts. If you want to take a lifetime off or an afternoon off, that's completely fine. When I was living in Santa Fe, I was running this place called the Dying Center. And I remember an experience I had where I was at the bedside of a woman who was in a great deal of physical pain. She was dying with cancer. This was before hospice got very good at titrating analgesic medication. And she was going to die in about 4 or 5 days. I felt a great deal of love for her. I sat at her bedside, and we were just in love with each other. And then it was Friday night, and I drove into town to have a couple of beers with my friend Richard, who was my best friend in the world. Richard had one of these kind of unusual lives where he had very little suffering. Women loved him for no apparent reason. He loved his mother. Money fell into his hands without him trying very hard. He had a very interesting business, which I won't talk about because it was partly illegal. But basically, he didn't suffer a lot. And I was sitting there with Richard, drinking a beer, and I thought, would I rather be, who's got the better life right now? This woman who's dying of cancer, or Richard? And I realized that I would rather be the woman who was dying of cancer. That in a way she was so alive. There's such a vibrance to each moment in her life. And obviously it would be great if we don't have to have cancer or have deep grief to inspire us to be awake in that way. Can we begin to find that awakeness with just the ordinary stuff of life? This teacher, Gurdjieff, that I mentioned right in the beginning, had this very sophisticated training as a Sufi, if you will. And he claimed that earlier in his life, he had so much personal power that if he just wanted to think about, if he needed something like money, he would just have to think about it in a certain way, and it would come to him. He said he could even kill an animal just using his mind from a mile away. I don't know how he found that out, but he said he could do that. He said, but in spite of having these powers, he could not remember himself in his language, be awake. He called it self-remembering. He said, I tried everything. He got a mala, he said a mantra. He said, I even tied a string around my finger, but I couldn't keep remembering myself. He said, so I thought maybe if I gave up those powers and I had to suffer like everybody else and struggle to make my life work, maybe the struggle itself would remind me. Maybe the suffering itself would remind me. He said, and it worked. So we don't have those powers to renounce, maybe, but we do have that suffering. We do have that struggle. Can the struggle itself be that which reminds us to be fully awake? There's a wonderful teacher, Nisargadatta Maharaj, who said, the mind creates the abyss, the heart crosses it. And grief work is the work of the heart. All the stories about what we've lost, how life would be different if such and such hadn't happened, is the realm of the mind. And in the realm of the mind, there is the abyss. There is suffering without end. Behind the solution to every problem lurks another problem. In the realm of duality, suffering arises. Until we connect with the heart in such a deep way that the heart becomes boundless and there is no limit to how we can love. So if there aren't further questions or remarks, then I'd like to guide a meditation. But would anybody like to say something? This is either I'm saying things really well or so obtusely nobody has any idea what I'm talking about. I'm not sure which it is.
I have a question.
Please.
My mind likes maintenance.
Okay.
And I remember you saying there were 5 stages of healing. And I've written down motivation.
I'm sorry,
You said there were 5
Right.
stages
Right.
of healing.
Okay.
You said one was motivation, and one was invocation, awareness, trusting, being present. This is what I wrote down. Number 3 was compassion,
And I didn't talk about 4 and 5 yet, did I? I was going to get to that, but why don't we do that now?
Thanks.
Let me just, as a short aside, I run this thing called the Living Dying Project. We have a very complete a very extensive website. And there is a diagram of this process here that I'm talking about. I should have brought some of these diagrams. Is there a photocopy machine here? Did Erin disappear?
Right here. Yeah, we'll give you a copy.
Okay, well, I've got this piece of paper, and I don't think I brought enough for everybody. Maybe there's even enough. I think there's enough. I got a whole stack of these. Here, you could pass those around. So, as I said, this diagram is on the website, but as well, there's all kinds of guided meditations by me, by Stephen Levine, by Joan Halifax, audio files, text files, YouTube channels. We're trying to make it the sort of like the go-to website for people interested in conscious dying. I do facilitate ongoing small groups, a maximum of 9 people in. There's one in Mill Valley on Wednesday nights that Diane is a member of here in the white blouse. There's a couple of them in Santa Rosa on Tuesday afternoons, and there's one in San Francisco on Monday evenings. And as I say, these are ongoing. There have been people in these groups for as long as 6 years.
Are you running the one on Thursday nights over at South Alicia at the hospital?
No.
Okay. I know there's this one.
So, motivation inspires us to do the difficult work of spiritual practice. Invocation allows us to trust being present in terms of mind, in terms of body, in terms of spirit or heart. As we become present, we begin then to open our hearts to what it is that's going on, the heart of compassion. And as the heart of compassion opens, this notion of separate self begins to dissolve. The sense of I, who's at the middle of everything, begins to relax. And as the I begins to dissolve, empowerment arises. Empowerment is really the main practice in some way of Tibetan Buddhism. And what I mean by empowerment is that which we have invoked in the beginning, we begin to see as our own true nature. It's not something separate. That the God or the higher power, the Divine Mother, Hanuman, whoever it is not in any way separate from our own true nature. And as we then feel that sense of empowerment, and that becomes part of our moment-to-moment experience of who we are, finally we move to non-duality or healing, what Eckhart Tolle, Ramana Maharshi, Adyashanti, various teachers talk about. And in fact, non-duality is the true healing. When one sees that there isn't a separate I who is grieving, then there's no more grief. At the same time, Denise's remark that here we are embodied and sometimes it's too much and we have to take some time off is certainly a reality. So I find this paradigm a very useful one. At the same time, there is a warning not to feel you've got to get to the end, and if you're not, you're a bad person, and you should feel guilty about the fact that you're still stuck in your emotions. Okay, so that's 4 and 5, empowerment and healing. Yes, please. What is your name?
Allison.
Hi, Allison.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about that transition from motivation to invocation. My experience personally of grief, but also in companioning so many bereaved individuals, is that it's an inherently disorganizing event and process and experience. So
Yeah.
that centeredness and that groundedness in that phase of invocation being with feels like a very challenging place to arrive.
And you are right. So I had a lot of motivation. I was very unhappy. I had a PhD in mathematics. I didn't want to be a PhD in math. I didn't want to be a mathematician. When I was younger, I stuttered a lot because I got some severe electrical shocks, different things. And so I had a real motivation to practice. And I became a very dedicated meditator. Did a lot of retreats, went to India, did the whole thing. And was still, at the end of a long retreat, a day later, was 99.9% as neurotic as before the retreat had started. So the movement from being motivated, you've got enough grief or you've got enough suffering in your life that you really want to do something about it, to actually being willing to be present is a big jump. I will admit that. And there's a couple things I can say about that. One is, if you're trying to do this process in a meditative, spiritual way, then it's very easy to lose the forest for the trees, in the sense that I would have a lot of agitated thoughts, restless thoughts, and I could pay attention to them in a retreat, or if I meditated long enough, my mind would calm down, but then it would get busy again. And when I finally got involved in some very sophisticated kind of somatic therapy and began to understand the grounding and centering piece, what I began to notice was that because I'd had these electrical shocks when I was very small, that I was trying to avoid the next shock. And so that a lot of what was going on in my mind was planning. And instead of taking a step back and having compassion and being aware of the place where I was feeling the world was unsafe, but I was just being with the effect, not the cause. I was being with all the planning thoughts. I had never dropped down to the place where I felt terrified that the world was unsafe and I might get electrocuted. Okay? Not literally electrocuted, but shocked in any number of different kinds of ways. So that very often, in fact always, we create a personality to avoid that deepest fear. And consequently, that first step of really being aware of what it feels like is often being directed by the place where we're most afraid. And we're paying attention to what we're willing to pay attention to, but without having sufficient support, without having a therapist or a meditation teacher or the right kind of support, it's going to be very difficult to drop down and be with that which is generating the personality. And the personality is going to be saying, it's time to take a break right now. You're getting a little too close. You're getting a little too close, so let's have a glass of wine, let's turn on the TV, let's do whatever we do to not feel, because right now it's getting too hot. And when I'm not interested in dying, I'm interested in transformation of consciousness. But as that story about my friend Richard and the other woman suggested, when one has a life-threatening prognosis, and of course we all do, but when it's really obvious, then there might be the motivation to wake up now. Okay, so the dying in itself isn't so interesting, but that I find it a great blessing to be around dying people. I'm going from here to a memorial service this afternoon. I had a client that died a couple weeks ago. It was such a blessing to be with him and his wife and his kids. I fell in love with them. And So the first point I'd like to make is that it takes a certain kind of understanding or courage or support to translate motivation into a willingness to invoke, to be present, to trust that it's okay to be with what it feels like now. And however you find doing that, I find that this process of being grounded and being in my belly, very, very useful. And for the longest time when I was living in New Mexico, my friend Richard had a golden retriever named Crandall, who was an enlightened dog, I think. And Richard moved off he took a long trip to Java for a few months, and Crandall and I were living together in the mountains of New Mexico, and I was trying to get down on my belly, trying to get centered for months, and it was so frightening, and I couldn't really, I was quite unsuccessful. But when finally I got this somatic piece of the previous developmental stage of being grounded, of learning to inhabit the base, instead of trying to figure it out with my mind. The Bible talks about the peace that passes understanding. Drop down into the belly, drop down below the belly into the base. Then getting grounded would be a lot easier. I mean, being in the belly would be a lot easier. And there's very little talk in the spiritual literature about being grounded because it's assumed you are. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing is that there is a lot of healing that happens in the interface between the belly and the heart. That the belly is, as I mentioned before, the belly is a foundation for the heart being open. And the heart's making bearable that which is arising as we inhabit the belly. So the belly contains a reservoir of grief, if you will, that we tend to shove unresolved emotions, suppressed grief, deep, deep down into the belly. As we learn to inhabit this part of our body, then feelings begin to arise, difficult feelings. The mind creates the abyss, the heart crosses it. If we can only be with these feelings with the mind, it's going to be overwhelming. And to really begin to open the heart in relationship. So it's not like we do the belly first and then the heart opens up. It's like back and forth, that the heart is bringing mercy to this moment, and that then allows whatever to arise. What is arising in your experience and my experience right now is the only possible and perfect experience in your healing journey. It's what is saying, I'm willing to be met now. I'm willing to be healed now. And you don't have to take the invitation right now. You can say, later for you, buddy. Or you can say, okay, as unpleasant as this is, now is the moment to heal that which is arising. Can I be aware of it? Can I be grounded and centered while I'm feeling it? Can I open my heart to what it feels like? Can I be empowered and realize that even this is a perfect and pure expression of who I am? When I was with Maharaji, Ram Dass came to Maharaji and he said, Maharaji, I'm so impure. I'm trying to do these practices and I'm so impure. And Maharaji looked up Ram Dass's sleeve and said, I don't see any impurity. So imagine what it would be like to be with somebody who saw you as totally pure when you were right in front of him, closer than I am to you, feeling greedy, lustful, anxious, and he kept seeing the part of me that was whole. Okay, that was a great blessing. But that is, in a way, the truth of the moment for each of us, whether we have the blessing of Maharaji to be looking up your sleeve and saying, there's no impurity, there's nothing tainted. That even the most difficult emotional pain is a perfect expression of how pure and perfect you are. Can we begin to So like the Dalai Lama saying, you Americans don't like yourselves. I remember once I was at a Tibetan Buddhist retreat, and the Lama said, okay, we're going to do a practice now. Everybody imagine your mother. He said, oh, wait, we can't do this because this is America. You don't necessarily like your mother. Right? He was using the mother as the symbol of pure love, of who you would love more than anybody, right? And he forgot. Okay.
Why do you think that is? Was there any knowledge there about what happened with Western?
Why do I think what is?
Like, that we have that separation between mothers and families and all of that. Like, why is that different in other places? And if you don't have time, that's fine.
Well, why isn't always the most interesting question, but and I've lived in Asia, in China, and India and places, and I'm not saying they have any big advantage over us. I mean, in this one particular area, maybe we have some psychological issues they don't. Kids tend to sleep in the bed with their parents and have a certain kind of relationship. But if I could choose my next incarnation, I'd probably want to be incarnated as a female growing up in the Bay Area, you know. But, and why is that so funny? Diane knows me too well. She knows why it's funny. Okay. So time has been flying by here. We only have 20 more minutes, so we will do this guided meditation. I promise. In answer to your question, what is your name again? Allison. There's a Thomas Merton quote. Love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart turns to stone. Love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart turns to stone. So it's nice when things through serendipity fall into place and the heart is open and practice is going well. But when in fact what we have to look at, we don't want to look at, in that moment can we invoke from our hearts, from our bodies, from our minds, so with enough motivation, can we invoke it so deeply that we can be with anything? And as we do that, then the heart begins to help. Then the heart feels supported, and the heart opens, and the heart makes more bearable that which arises next. Any other quick remarks or questions before we do a guided meditation? We'll meditate for about 20 minutes. Begin, please, by examining your motivation. What is your heart's desire? What do you most truly want for the rest of your life? Do you believe that there is a path beyond suffering? You will die, but you don't know when. Life is precious. Whatever we do, think, or say has a real effect. When we act, think, or speak with attachment, suffering will arise. Can all of this motivate us during these next few minutes to look with great courage and clarity at our experience? So that we don't have to assume that at the end of this short period of time we'll be the same person. We're willing to die into this next moment, letting go of who we think we are. Invoking then from the depth of your heart that which you trust, living spirit, the Mother, the Christ, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, higher power, spirit of truth. Invoking in the sense of being willing to receive, open to, accept that which is always and everywhere present, which is in fact our own true nature. Nothing separate, nothing to be accomplished. Allowing the mind and the heart to trust that whatever might arise, there's no need to grasp, no need to fix or change or improve. Letting experience arise naturally, openly. The heart, the mind, invoking, trusting. And then bringing this trust also into your body physically, firstly by taking a few grounding breaths. Imagine that as you're breathing in, you're pushing an energetic egg out through the base of your torso. If it helps you to inhabit this part of your body, you can tighten those muscles down at the very base and the perineum, the upper adductor muscles. With each in-breath, pushing down and out through the base of your torso. Feeling the sense of stability and confidence, connectedness and groundedness, of nourishment that is infinitely available. then letting your attention move up from the base to your lower belly, a few inches below your navel, and a few inches inside the front of your body. And as you breathe out, as you let go of breath, let go, die down into your belly. Easy, natural in-breath. Soft belly, releasing, relaxing, opening the belly, releasing any clinging to I in your shoulders, and letting the belly fill with energy as you breathe in. Not, though, with a doing, not with any grasping. At first, it might seem you're paying attention from up above to this place down below. Explore the possibility of letting your sense of I drop down into the belly. So as you breathe out, you die into the belly, and you're hearing my voice from your belly, from this stance of being energetically centered at the center of gravity of who you are physically and energetically. So that all the thoughts and sounds and physical sensations that arise and pass away moment to moment are being received from the still point center. The ego structure will not like to be ignored for too very long. There will be resistance arising. The mind will want to think. Notice this, and with the next out-breath, drop down, die into the belly. Letting go of any tension in the belly and the shoulders. Letting the belly fill with chi, with shakti. And letting this then be a very brief foundation for opening your heart, beginning to breathe into your heart as if you had nostrils in the center of your chest, letting the full belly support the opening of the heart, the boundless heart of compassion, the heart filling with loving kindness, with compassion, with gratitude and forgiveness. Any suffering, any grief, any loss, any painful emotion that may have been shoved down into the belly, that may be appearing to you in your life now or in the recent past. Can the belly be strong enough, full enough to support the heart that is totally boundless, that can not only open to your own suffering, but any suffering that might arise of those around you, you becoming a force for compassion and healing as you move through the world. Vast sky-like heart. You are the sky no matter what clouds might happen to drift through. Grounded, centered, open heart. letting the I dissolve in this vast spaciousness. Nothing to cling to, nothing to fix, nothing to understand. So simple. And in this spaciousness, it is revealed that that which you invoked is your true nature in this moment, in every moment. You are that which is pure, which is whole. And that each arising experience, no matter what the content, is a pure expression of this true nature, being less concerned with the content than our relationship with it, than the nature of it. Each moment, a pure expression of wholeness. Nothing we can think or feel or do can ever separate us from this truth. The qualities of the awakened mind are firstly vast spaciousness, no separate I to cling to, secondly clarity, the knowing quality, being with each arising. And finally, naturally arising compassionate activity. When we begin to trust this openness, the spacious heart-mind, our true nature is compassion, shines forth. A true wish that all beings might be free from suffering, that you and all other beings might be liberated and realize the true nature of your mind, that you and all beings might live in a state of peace and compassion. Letting ourselves be touched by the vastness of our hearts so that we don't need to think of this only as a meditative state, but as who we are moment to moment, before the bell rings, after the bell rings. When we feel separate, when we feel any grief, that is the motivation to once again trust our own nature, to surrender into who we truly are. Without any work, any pushing, any improving, any effort, other than the effort to surrender into that which is already present. Being fully available for all of the human dimension of life in and around us. The finiteness as it arises within the vastness of who we are. Asking ourselves, is there anything more important? Anything that we need to understand or collect or do that is more important than resting in this openness? So now comes the hard part of the retreat, going off into the world. And I did put a piece of paper over there on the middle of the book table if you'd like to get on the Living Dying Project mailing list. We send out very little, maybe half a dozen emails a year, so you won't be bombarded. I didn't mention that the website is livingdying.org. I don't think that's even on this piece of paper. No, it's not really. You're welcome to call up the project if you'd like to talk to me or find out about groups or workshops that might be happening. Are there any remarks or questions before we break for lunch?
I do, Dale. Do you have any knowledge of tantric practices in grief work?
That's a very large question. And
For a very short time, I'm sorry.
okay. And do you mean in what sense are you using the word tantric? Are you talking about with another partner or
Yeah,
the larger sense of the word tantra?
the larger sense, mostly
Okay.
But also just the physicalness of it, right? I mean, one of the things for me, other than maybe Irene, is that the act of touch or the process of touch never ever gets addressed here. It seems
Okay.
physically, or it seems primarily contemplative or psychological or didactic. Not much touching going on. And in my experience, it seems like a really quick way or a faster way to go into that process.
Okay. So in Hinduism, and in Buddhism too, there's yoga and there's tantra. Those are the two main paths. Yoga means yoke, where we unite ourselves with the path, and we watch what goes into our mouth and out of our mouth, and what we do with our genitals, and how we breathe, and how we do all that stuff. And Tantra, which is really the basis of what I've been talking about today, the meditation we did was a Tantric meditation. Tantra is coming from the understanding that it's all the mother. It can all be worshipped and met fully with love. And so in yoga, you drink chamomile tea and you don't drink whiskey. In Tantra, whiskey is just as much God as chamomile tea. And that's a kind of tricky path if you just think you can go around drinking whiskey all the time and don't have the foundation to do that. But the way we did that meditation was a tantric meditation, where by creating a foundation, we can then meet whatever arises. And whether that's in a meditative setting or touching another human being, we're using that as our relationship with the divine, as our worshipful encounter with the mother, who is all form and matter and thought and energy in one particular way of looking at things. So, just as I said before, one can, when suffering arises, one can push it away or one can get lost in it. It's the same when we're talking about touch and conscious touch. Did you mention Irene Smith? Is that what you were saying? Has she been here today? Okay.
The last one.
Okay. Well, she's a very, very dear person and talks about conscious touch a lot. And but it's also certainly possible to touch in an attached way. And as you're saying, it's a shortcut. Well, it can be if you're doing it consciously, if you're doing it with awareness and with an open heart. So whether we're touching or sitting still meditating or in therapy or whatever of these channels of body, heart, and mind that we're using, the same blockages will come up in each of us. I mean, the same blockages will come up no matter which channel you're using. The blockages for you might not be the same for me, but I certainly do feel that my body and the messages from my body, where I get most of my, maybe I shouldn't touch that little thing, are where I get most of my information. The mind is very tricky and seductive. My mind in particular, I don't trust. So, if you find that touch is a way of connecting with the mother, of feeling devotion for this human condition, that's fantastic. Yoga itself is a difficult path in this very fraught age with electronics and all the complication of I spent Friday was supposed to be a day where I was going to get some creative work done, and I had 2 computer meltdowns that were completely not my fault, and GoDaddy tech support was less than helpful, but anyway. So can I remember that's the mother when the guy is, all that stuff. It's not it's not so easy. Any other remarks or questions before we break?
Steve Jobs said, never tell your computer you're in a hurry.
And Steve Jobs was a devotee of Maharaji, actually. And he invented he didn't, but he had the notion of the Macintosh personal computer at Maharaji's ashram on an LSD trip long ago. Not all of the guts of the machine, but that's where he first thought of. But that was a very good idea, not to get too mad at your computer or rushed. No. Anybody else? Okay, so I guess lunch is happening really soon.
Yeah,